Hello, everyone. This is Kenneth with the Advancing Equity Coalition here with Heather to give you our debrief slash analysis slash random thoughts on last night's school board meeting in Minneapolis for Minneapolis Public Schools. How are you doing today, Heather?
Good.
Good. I'm feeling a little tired. That board meeting went long and late. It went long and late.
And a lot of places.
Yeah, covered a lot of ground. So yeah, we're excited to kind of digest it with you. And so I think the first thing that really pushes the time of school board meetings is the amount of public comment that is provided. And so I feel like last night they had the full slate of public comment, all 25 slots filled. And they were decisively anti-CDD, which I thought we might have been back in March or April at first, because this was deja vu all over again. But yeah, Heather, what were your thoughts? What were you hearing during the public comment section?
Well, first of all, I think there's like what we heard, and then there's like what we didn't hear. I mean, one of the things that we learned was that there's a group of parents that really worked hard to organize and plan, and they really wanted to talk about dyslexia. They sent emails to the board. They collected stories from parents and from students. And they really want the district to do something more meaningful around our literacy for kiddos with dyslexia. And we are abysmally failing students with that. And so then the entire public board comment ended up being kind of sucked up by a group of people who was asking for the board to vote on something that didn't end up even making it to the board agenda.
Yeah. I'll also say that we know that, our folks, some of our coalition members at Cal, especially also wanted to utilize some of that public comment to support the ethnic studies resolution, which passed unanimously last night. And so we've been able to hear from their support in the past, and we know this is something that the district has been working on for a while. So there wasn't I don't think any real concern about it not passing, but it would have been interesting to hear, like, are people truly satisfied with it being a semester-long graduation requirement? There's also a lot of conversation yesterday amongst the board members about pushing ethnic studies into middle school and elementary school. And then also things that we've talked about, which is like saying ethnic studies for me otherizes it. This is like just world studies. And I think saying ethnic studies really centers like a white dominant understanding of history and the world and reality. So anyways, all that being said, we didn't get to hear any of that narrative because there was, a force of people who did come and share concern about moving forward with the comprehensive district design in the middle of a pandemic. And again, not to diminish the concerns of families that called in, but the board voted on this in the middle of a pandemic. So I don't know how much movement was going to be made. If any movement were to be made, it did need to make it on the agenda. And what we understand is that Director Walzer did not have the support to put it on the agenda, yet all of the public comment was asking to support the resolution on the agenda to delay the comprehensive district design. And so I already went in on it enough in our other video about how I feel about how organized that was and the leadership failure there by Director Walzer and how he's represented his district and been an ambassador for the school district for the last 4 years. So if you want to hear my very spicy thoughts on it, check out the other video from last night. But yeah, I don't know. There's some things that were said during public comment last night that I was just floored, right? Like, again, I understand, the pandemic is a concern that everybody has. Can we execute this well during the CDD and all this change management in the middle of a pandemic? Like, those are real questions that I think the board needs to ask and to be monitoring. But we cannot monitor it if we're always the only thing that we're doing is criticizing the CDD.
That's right. That's right.
And so, I don't know, were there any comments that specifically stood out to you, that you can recall from last night's conversation?
I mean, I think it was, for me, it was really just this idea that kids can't change buildings after this pandemic. And I really think this is kind of a great opportunity for us. Like, we're all discombobulated. Nobody's in a building right now. Maybe if we just stopped thinking about the fact that we can't, this kind of seems like the perfect opportunity to move everybody around. I don't necessarily know that you're going to ever look at a group of families and schools and be like, this is the year we want disruption. That's never going to happen. And yet we have a white supremacist district that unfairly and inequitably does not serve an entire demographic of students. So we have to have disruption. And so, like, we're already disrupted, right? Like, maybe while we're here, let's just go a little further, and we can do this. I think if we just kind of stop saying that we have to not do this and start thinking about all of the ways in which we can, maybe we could get through some of these conversations. And I feel like some of the board members were saying that too, like last night, like especially when I don't know if I'm getting too far ahead, but we started talking about the bell time study. It was like, okay, we gotta think about this. Like, again, I understand that nobody's like thrilled with every single bell time. We had 29 different bell times and now we have 5. That seems like an improvement from a systems perspective. And it seems like we're going to have many buildings that are going to have better opportunities for after school programming. Like, that's the thing we have to remember. We are not holding up this system in which every school in our district was already amazing. That's not what was happening.
Right. I think you bring up two important points. I'd say the first one is around, there's an opportunity here that, like, no one really has a home base. Like, I guess there's a virtual home base that people maybe feel connected to, but there's no real connection to buildings. Something that came up last night is, teachers are going to have, or students are going to have new teachers are going to have new students. Unless they're in Montessori or like another program like that, most teachers don't see they see new students every year, right? Whether they're in a different building. And there's the problem that I have, right? Is like, more, yeah, I guess it'll be hard to have new students, but you see new students every year. But are you worried about seeing a different type of student? And I think there is some coded racism in there around protecting, our majority white teaching force. And, when you have more seniority, you get to move your way over to our whiter schools and asking them maybe to now go to a school that is more diverse. Now they have not just different students, but a different type of student, right? A different group of students that they aren't used to teaching. And honestly, in some ways, use their seniority to, make their way to different parts of town. I think that's just, no, I think that's one thing that really jumps out to me. I think the second thing that really jumps out to me is, like you said, we're already disrupted. And I heard people say, like, delay to 22, 23. So what you're telling me is you want to be disrupted this year, then go back to school for one more year, and then disrupt students in that year. Like, that is 3 years of disruption.
Right. Let's just rip the Band-Aid off.
Right. Like, they're already disrupted. Like, let's just do this now, as opposed to saying, like, let's bring you back to some sense of normalcy, quote unquote normalcy, and then, make you go through this trauma that everyone is, everyone's calling this some level of trauma. That's what, like, the key message clearly was yesterday, that this is really traumatic. And what I was hearing is they want to bring people back to some sense of normalcy and then create some more trauma again in a year. And that doesn't feel strategic to me. And I get, like, yeah, maybe this trauma is additive and, all that stuff. But we can do multiple hard things at the same time. And I think that gets a little lost.
And we've been asking one demographic of kids to do multiple hard things at the same time on repeat for generations. That's
Right.
the other part of the story, right? It's who we are asking to do hard things and when.
Right. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, because right now what we know is that folks are going through the pandemic, an emotional election season, obviously all the aftermath of, you know, George Floyd and some of the unrest that has taken place, and the conversations with the police department that's been taking place in the city. And then also all of the violent crime that's taking place in North specifically.
Mhm.
But if you remove the pandemic, right, all of a sudden these are things that folks are going through all the time. But a lot of this is happening to communities of color. And not
That's
to
right.
say that, people of color weren't calling in yesterday. There are clearly folks of color that are calling in yesterday, to say delay the CDD. I just think that, again, how many times do we want to re-legislate this issue when there are other things that are on the table that deserve your attention, right? And maybe the CDD is a like bringing up trying to peel back or delay the CDD could also be really distracting, because there are like the bell time situation is a real thing that folks did not pay much attention to, that you
That's
and I
right.
thought would be really important for folks to know that
Same.
yeah,
Yes.
there are just lots of people that are going to have new school start times, and what does that mean, and what type of schools, and what are the populations, and all these different things. Are they going to be attractive if they're at this start time or this end time or whatever? How many schools are actually going to be gaining after school program? But we didn't get to have that conversation because, again, we have board members, namely Director Walzer, but other board members as well, right, that wanted to see the CDD delayed. And instead of talking about the issues at hand and to make the best of maybe a policy that he doesn't 100% agree with, instead of focusing on what else can we do to improve this situation, he
Hmm.
just said, I'm not even going to acknowledge this issue, even though this will deeply impact the schools in my area and my constituents. I am going to try to delay the CDD fruitlessly, because and I'm saying it was fruitless because he did not even get the issue on the agenda,
Yeah.
right? And that I can't help
Well,
it.
and are we doing families a service by continuing to bring this up, or should we, as a board member, be talking to our constituents about what their choices are now, right? So really, to me, it feels like we need to be talking much more to families about. So what do you want to do for next year? You can choose this, or you're out, or the choice is going to be here. So I think good information helps people, like helps to abate fear, but like kind of constantly bringing up this, like we have to delay this thing. Um, I just don't know if that's like, I think about this as like you're a leader and a public civil servant, and like not everything that you vote on or that you are a part of is something you're going to be on board with. And also, now it's here. So what do your constituents need? What
Right.
do your constituents need?
And I think we need to acknowledge, right? Like we were really supportive of the CDD. We also need to acknowledge that we didn't think every part of the CDD is perfect. And we saw the opportunity to say, like, we thought the foundation of the CDD was good to move forward with, and we recognize that not everyone was there, right? And so
Yep.
maybe that's where they want to, that's the fight that they still want to continue to have. But while they want to have that fight, there are now things being built on top of that initial decision that are like, there are decisions being layered on top of that they're just not, their voices aren't being heard in. And there are other things to just be fighting for, right? Like if you're concerned about, what new school your child is going to, you should be demanding a clearer academic plan around what community schools are going to get or what magnet schools are going to get. If you're concerned about the level of instruction that's taking place in your new school, right? You should be demanding, what is the plan to have, stable quality instruction in each of our school buildings. If you're concerned about the safety and climate of your of your new school building, you should be demanding more details and say like what you want to see staff held accountable to in terms of the culture and climate and the behavior and the response to behavior that's taking place in your building. Like, these are things that we need to also be having discussions about. And if you want to have a both and, I think that's great. If you want to fight and delay the CDD and also participate in the bell time conversation, that's great, right? If you want to fight for how our community school is going to be better, or magnet school is going to be better, or the, you know, the criteria to use for, you know, who should be in what magnet schools, like that, that's great. I think that's fine if you want to keep having those conversations. But if you're missing out on participating in these conversations happening because you're still fighting the CDD, the votes, frankly, the votes just aren't there. The votes are not there to delay the CDD at this moment. And even with the election, they're not going to be there either. In fact, right, like 2 of the board members that voted against the CDD are now leaving office, right? And I'm not saying that has anything to do with the CDD or against the CDD or whatever, but just if you're doing the math, right, the votes are not there right now to delay or pause the CDD. And so what are you going to do with your energy? What are you going to do with your time? And clearly, you know, folks decided last night that they still wanted to call in about the CDD and delaying it, as opposed to talking about bell times or talking about ethnic studies or talking about the myriad of other issues that are out there that also exist. And I'm just a guy, I don't know, but I just feel like
who watches a lot of board meetings.
Right. But I just feel like there are other places where we need the energy of those folks. We need the voices and perspective of the folks that called in to delay the CDD, to weigh in on the other decisions that are coming in fast and furious right now. So I don't know.
And to be paying attention for student experience across our city, right? I mean, so I think I come back to this a lot when we were going through and we were getting ready to build the framework for the CDD way before it rolled out. And we were just talking about the way that the district treats, sees, teaches kids of color. That boardroom was quiet, right? And so like, now is an opportunity for all of us to actually talk about the hard things beyond just the delay the CDD messaging, right? And to say like, okay, we need to do better to improve these experiences, and we need to do better to improve academic outcomes. And like, we got to kind of start to talk about those things together as a community beyond the delaying of this thing. That's just, I just kind of feel like that's where we need to go if we're going to get there.
Right.
But in the meantime, we're in distance learning.
We're in distance learning,
and we rolled it back to 2.
We rolled it back to phase 2, and we learned a lot about what staff and students are experiencing during this phase of distance learning. The number one thing that we learned is that all groups think that distance learning in the fall is better than what distance learning was like in the spring, which granted for me is like a pretty low bar from my understanding. I mean, yeah. And you know, to folks' credit, like, look, you tried to put together a whole model of education in 2 weeks to serve, you know, 35,000 students, and, you know, make sure that, you know, 3,000 or 6,000 teachers or whatever it is, you know, had the support that they needed in order to execute on this well. Like, yeah, that was going to be a disaster. It was built that way. The summer seems like it's put together more intentional planning, and it's creating more fruitful results in terms of their experience. We don't know what the results are in terms of academic outcomes. We're starving for that information. But at the same time, it seems like, you know, things are going better despite the dominant narrative that we're hearing. And I think that's a little bit around what we wanted to talk about during this video. So yeah, Heather, do you want to talk a little bit about what we learned versus what we're hearing, and what the tension is, what seems to be the tension there?
Well, it seems like we're hearing a lot about the fact that teachers are unhappy or deeply unhappy. And, you know, there's been some pickets, there's been some protests, there's been some calls for action. And then the teacher survey results come out, and I'm floored. Like, the survey results do not reflect the narrative that we're hearing. And probably like both are a little true, right? Like, this is a really hard time to really truly connect with each other. And I think that's valid, but I do think it's important to remember there's like 50% of our teachers who are like, I'm collaborating well, or or this is going okay, or this is way better. And I don't necessarily know. I think that sometimes we get confused that like we're choosing between two good things right now and we're not, right? We're really just kind of like, I think Director Arneson said it last night. We're kind of walking on a tightrope of choices and none of them feel great, but we're kind of always trying to figure out the next sort of closest, rightest one that lives within our values.
Mhm.
And so it feels like there are a group of teachers who seem to be adaptable and who seem to be connecting with their students and who seem to enjoy teaching in this format. And I just think it's important to remember that that's real too.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I will say that I pause and question whether they enjoy teaching in this
That's
format.
true.
Like
That's
maybe
true.
they do, maybe they do. I'm not saying. I actually did talk to a teacher that said that they are
I've
loving
heard
distance
that.
learning. Yeah, like they're able to be more flexible, do their thing, whatever. Like, and that's great for them. But and so I do wonder, like, we know that 62% of teachers that did the survey said that they are feeling positive, have positive feelings essentially towards distance learning in the fall. I wonder, like, how much of that, like, what's the comparison? Is it the comparison to being in the classroom? Is it the comparison to what distance learning was like in the spring? And so I do want to acknowledge, like, the context of we don't exactly know
Yeah.
what they're feeling, more like why they're feeling positive about it. We do know that they're like you said, they're talking about instruction is going well. They feel like collaboration with colleagues is going well. And maybe they're feeling those ways despite the fact that there's a pandemic and that we're not in our classrooms and in person with our teachers, with other teachers and with students every day, right? Like, and maybe that's where that comes into play. But I want to caution, like, our understanding of this data survey isn't that says 62% say that this is going great, right? Like, we're not saying that. I think what we're saying is we've heard a very dominant narrative from the last few months that says, like, distance learning is terrible.
Yeah.
We this isn't going well. And the survey results that we saw also reflect one of the biggest concerns, which is like workload. Like, workload is too much for teachers, and actually students are also saying like their schoolwork is too much. But these are just like really, really hard things to figure out. And we know that the union is wanting to see some level of change in how distance learning is really going. But I don't know. It just feels like yeah, like you said, we were floored that this is the data that came out. And it just, there has to be truth somewhere in between, right? There's one side to a story, there's another side to the story, and then there's the truth. And so we know that there's the truth exists somewhere in the middle of all that. But
I mean, and even when you think about it in the terms of like student satisfaction, so we heard, like, I've just heard like so many stories, like my kids can't handle this or this is hard or whatever. And like the student survey was like, not what I was expecting. I mean, again, like you said, maybe students are comparing it to spring versus not to school. But I do see a sense of like, we are accepting this is better than what it was. And I mean, I would say, for my own children, like that's kind of how I feel like they are. It's like, yes, we'd like to see our friends. Yes, we miss this, but like this is what it is. And sometimes the Zoom calls are really long, and some days they let us have just sign in and be done. And that's just kind of like how it's going. This is what we have.
right. Yeah, and I mean, I think like the thing is that I think there are things to address and to change and modify for distance learning to satisfy both groups. Because what we haven't talked about so far is that while the student survey results also floored you, I think for me, I actually wasn't as surprised, because it was still only 45%. And I don't know, that's kind of low. And after I saw the teacher results, I was like, oh, they say instruction's going well. They say all these things are going well. But students are like, no, we're not satisfied. We
Mhm.
don't feel like we have an adult to check. Half of us don't feel like we have an adult that checks in on us every day or regularly. And so that, I think there are just lots of things to change and modify still in order make the best of the situation. But I think what I'm just really stuck on is what's going to be best ultimately for students. And what we heard from students is that they want more social interactions. They want, to be able to have more accessibility to their teachers. And
Especially it sounded like one-on-one. It
yeah, they
really
wanted more.
sounded like they wanted to be able to ask a question, to get a response from a question. They wanted to be able, like, where is my grade? They wanted that kind of response.
Yeah, but I also saw a comment in the deck around like being able to like get a response via email from a teacher. And another thing that we know that's going on, and so like, these are all Venn diagrams and all these things, is that because the union, wanted to make a statement to the district, and they've been picketing and wanting to change the conditions around how distance learning is going, they just started to take a really, really hard line in the sand with their duty hours. And so they said that they weren't going to respond to emails, take extra meetings, whatever, past the school day, which has impacted, like, apparently, from what we are hearing, grading papers, answering student questions, and like students' senses of feeling like their teachers are accessible. And we saw that in the data, right? Like,
Yep.
they're literally pointing out this action. Well, they're not saying this action that the teachers have done, but this is now impacting student experience and how students feel about school and how distance learning is going. And so on one hand, it's a really effective action by the teachers. Like, they're making their point known. We are not going to answer these emails, do these things. And it's impacting students, so you need to like come to a resolution with us. At the same time, I don't know if this best serves students. I think they probably think so in the long run, but we don't have 10 years with every student, right? We also as a district do not make up lost learning very well. Also, like, we know that as a true fact. So if we're losing learning and we know we don't make it up, sacrificing a day, a week, a month of student experience and how their learning is going, especially in a situation that's so tenuous and different than what we know, it just doesn't feel like that's gonna yield the results that we ultimately want to see.
Yeah, and I think that for me, there's a really important distinction between like an 8 to 4 and then between a teacher working like 15-hour days consecutively. Like, I've heard stories about teachers, and by the way, like, I've seen the amount of work that goes into lessons when I'm listening to the kids and stuff, and like, I can tell what it took to put that together. Like, I was a teacher. I know how many hours it takes to write a good lesson plan and then to do it in an entirely different way. I just wonder though, if like for some teachers, would it be easier for them to put their kids to bed and at 9 o'clock at night sit down and be able to respond to students? And now they kind of like feel like they can't or shouldn't. And so I don't know. I understand the intent of the action. Just wonder if like the action is really in support of this group of people who's like in charge of this hard situation.
Right. We like
won't solve it probably.
Yeah. We like to center and we like to center our conversations, and we know that Julia Freeman at Voices for Racial Justice always brings us back to what is best for the students, what's best for the kids, and whether it's focusing on good governance and what are the issues that are in front of us that we need to deal with, or whether it's figuring out how we can improve student experience, and how what is the teachers and the teachers unions part in that. We need to
might be bell times, it might be
right.
right.
Like, we need to know that like at the center of all these decisions is like what is going to be best for students, and what adults are going to be courageous enough to actually stand up and say what is right and what is wrong.
That's right.
And we just aren't there as a city right now to like name, that is where we need to create the political will.
That's right.
And so that is work that I'm interested in doing. I know you're interested in doing. We want to do together. So with that being said, this video has been long enough.
It was such a big meeting with so much stuff. We couldn't make it shorter.
It was a lot of content.
A
So
lot
our other video is actually the short video. So if you haven't seen it, check it out. It's shorter than this one at least. But
And
thanks for tuning in.
we saved you almost 4 hours, so don't get mad at us.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks for doing this, Heather.
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth. Bye.
Bye.